The summer sun beat down on the back parking lot of the Bellamy Hotel as Melissa Jenkins pulled her beaten-up Honda into an empty spot. She sat for a moment, air conditioning wheezing its last cool breaths before she turned off the ignition. The clock on her dashboard read 4:47 p.m., 13 minutes before her shift started. Normally, she'd use those precious minutes to touch up her makeup or grab a quick snack from the vending machine, but today she just needed to sit and breathe. It's just another Saturday shift, she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel. But it wasn't just another shift. The Bellamy was hosting the Peterson-Williams wedding tonight, supposedly the biggest event of the summer season. Over 200 guests were expected to fill the grand ballroom. The tips would be great, she reminded herself. She needed those tips. At 26, Melissa had imagined her life would look different than this, rushing to waitressing shifts at a fancy hotel where she served people who lived the life she once thought would be hers. 3 years ago, she'd been a promising piano student at the prestigious Eastland Conservatory, her future bright with possibilities of concert halls and recording contracts. With a deep sigh, she grabbed her black apron from the passenger seat and stepped out into the heat. The service entrance at the back of the hotel was propped open with a brick, letting out blessed waves of air conditioning. As she slipped inside, she tied her long brown hair into a neat ponytail and straightened her white button-up shirt. The kitchen was already buzzing with activity. Chefs barked orders as line cooks prepared elegant appetizers. The pastry team was putting final touches on a 5-tier wedding cake that looked like something from a magazine cover. There you are. The voice belonged to Greg, the floor manager, a balding man in his 40s with perpetually sweaty palms and a too-tight suit. Staff meeting in 3 minutes. Don't be late. Melissa nodded and hurried to the break room to stash her purse in her locker. Inside, a few of her co-workers were already gathered, their faces showing the same mix of dread and resignation she felt. Big events meant big money, but also big stress. Did you hear who's getting married? Asked Tanya, a server who'd been at the Bellamy for almost a decade. It's the daughter of that real estate guy, the one who owns half the buildings downtown, and the son of some big-shot music professor. Melissa's stomach tightened. Music professor? Yeah, from the conservatory. Williams or Williamson or something. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Melissa's feet. Williams? Professor Richard Williams? Tanya snapped her fingers. That's the one. You know him. Before Melissa could answer, Greg appeared at the door, clapping his hands for attention. Everyone to the service area now. The staff shuffled out, but Melissa moved as if underwater, her mind racing. Professor Richard Williams, the man who had stood on stage after her final performance, his face a mask of disappointment as he announced to the entire audience that her interpretation lacked discipline and emotional maturity. The man who had given her the failing grade that had effectively ended her music career. The man who had told her in front of her peers that some students simply didn't have what it took to be true artists. The service area was crowded with waitstaff, bartenders, and bussers. Greg stood on a chair at the front, clipboard in hand. Listen up, people. The Peterson-Williams wedding is not just any event. Mr. Peterson is one of the hotel's biggest investors, and this needs to be perfect. He began calling out assignments. Melissa half listened, hoping she'd be stationed at one of the peripheral tables, or better yet, assigned to past appetizers during the cocktail hour. Jenkins, Greg's voice cut through her thoughts. You'll be handling the head table. Melissa's heart dropped. The head table? Yes, the head table. Parents of the bride and groom, maid of honor, best man. VIPs. Problem? 24 pairs of eyes turned to her. She swallowed hard. I don't think I should serve the head table. Greg's face darkened. And why is that? How could she explain? That Professor Williams had crushed her dreams with a few callous words? That the thought of serving him made her feel physically ill? I know Professor Williams. From before. It would be awkward. Greg stepped down from his chair and moved closer to her, lowering his voice. Look, Jenkins, we're short-staffed as it is. The Andersons called in sick and we've got no replacements. You're one of our best servers and the head table needs the best. But no buts. Either you take the head table or you can find another job. His eyes softened slightly. I need you tonight, Melissa. She wanted to argue further, but what could she say? That she was still nursing a wounded ego 3 years later? That she was afraid? Rent was due next week and her roommate had already covered for her last month when she'd come up short. Fine, she said, the word feeling like sand in her mouth. Greg nodded, relief visible on his face, and continued with his assignments. Melissa stood frozen, barely hearing the rest of the meeting. When it broke up, she headed to the bathroom and locked herself in a stall, pressing her forehead against the cool metal door. The memory of that day played in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. She had chosen a daring, modernist piece for her final performance, something that pushed boundaries and showcased her unique interpretation. She'd poured everything into it, taking artistic liberties that felt right to her soul. When she struck the final note, there had been a moment of silence before applause broke out. She'd thought it was appreciation. Then Professor Williams had stood up. "What we've just witnessed," he had said, his voice echoing through the recital hall, "is an example of potential without discipline, technical skill without understanding." This interpretation showed a fundamental misunderstanding of the composer's intent and lacked the emotional maturity required of a true artist. She'd stood there, her hands still hovering over the keys as he announced her failing grade. 3 years of training, of late nights and early mornings at the practice rooms, of sacrificing everything for music, all erased in one moment. A knock on the bathroom stall jolted her back to the present. "Hey, you okay in there?" It was Tanya. Melissa wiped her eyes and opened the door. "I'm fine," Tanya gave her a knowing look. "You're not fine. What's the deal with this professor guy?" Melissa leaned against the sink. "He was my professor at the conservatory. He failed me on my final performance. Humiliated me in front of everyone. I dropped out after that. And now you have to serve him dinner at his son's wedding," Tanya finished. "That's rough." "I can't do it, Tanya. I'll freeze up or spill something or—" "Hey." Tanya put her hands on Melissa's shoulders. "Yes, you can. You're not that student anymore. You're a professional doing a job. And after tonight, you never have to see him again." Melissa took a deep breath. Tanya was right. It was just one night. She could get through one night. Besides, Tanya added with a smirk, you can always accidentally spill something on his lap. That brought a small smile to Melissa's face. "I'd get fired." "Worth it." The two women laughed, and for a moment the weight on Melissa's chest lightened. She splashed cold water on her face and reapplied her light makeup. By the time she entered the grand ballroom to begin setting up her tables, Melissa had constructed a mental wall between herself and the task ahead. She wouldn't think about who would be sitting at the table, just focus on the job. The white linen tablecloths gleamed under the crystal chandeliers. Centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath adorned each table. The room looked magical, like something from a fairy tale. The first guests began to arrive at 6, filing into the ballroom for the pre-dinner cocktail hour. Melissa moved efficiently through the crowd with her tray of champagne flutes, smiling and nodding at the guests who thanked her. So far, no sign of Professor Williams. Maybe he was busy with wedding party photos or last-minute preparations. Her hope dissolved when Greg appeared at her elbow. "Head table guests are being seated. Time to take your position." With leaden feet, Melissa made her way to the elevated table at the front of the room. And there he was, Professor Richard Williams, looking exactly as she remembered him. Tall and lean, with silver hair swept back from his forehead, wearing an expensive suit that accentuated his ramrod-straight posture. He was smiling and shaking hands with the father of the bride, completely unaware that the student whose career he'd derailed was about to serve him dinner. Taking a deep breath, Melissa approached the table with a pitcher of ice water. "Good evening," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "May I pour you some water?" One by one, she filled the glasses of the wedding party members. When she reached Professor Williams, her hand trembled slightly, but she managed to pour without spilling a drop. He didn't even look up, engaged in conversation with the woman beside him. He didn't recognize her. Relief washed over Melissa. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe he wouldn't remember her, and she could get through the night without incident. She had just finished pouring the last glass when Professor Williams finally glanced her way. Their eyes met, and for a moment there was nothing, no recognition in his gaze. Then his eyes narrowed, and Melissa saw it happen. The subtle shift as memory clicked into place. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the table's conversation. "Don't I know you?" The pitcher felt suddenly heavy in Melissa's hands. Around the table, curious eyes turned toward her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "You were a student at the conservatory," he continued, his tone clinical. as if he were identifying a specimen. Jenkins, was it? The one with the unorthodox interpretation of Prokofiev. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor. But she stood her ground. Yes, sir. Melissa Jenkins. I'll be your server this evening. The appetizers will be out shortly. As she turned to leave, his voice followed her. Interesting to find you here. I always wondered what became of you after you left the program. The words hit her like a physical blow. The implication was clear. Look how far you've fallen. From promising pianist to serving me at my son's wedding. Melissa walked away, her back straight, her face a mask of professional composure. But inside something was building, an emotion she couldn't quite name. Part anger, part shame, and part something else, something that felt strangely like the beginning of courage. In the kitchen, Melissa's hands shook as she leaned against the stainless steel prep counter. The clatter of dishes and shouts of kitchen staff faded into the background as she tried to steady her breathing. 3 years had passed since Professor Williams had crushed her dreams, yet his condescending tone still had the power to make her feel small. You okay? Tanya appeared beside her, balancing a tray of salad plates. You look like you've seen a ghost. He recognized me, Melissa whispered. He looked at me like I was exactly where he expected me to end up. Tanya frowned. Forget him. He's just one more rich guy who thinks the world revolves around him. She nudged Melissa gently. Come on, those appetizers aren't going to serve themselves. Melissa nodded, gathering her professional demeanor like armor. She loaded her tray with plates of fancy appetizers, tiny pastries filled with goat cheese and fig, delicate shrimp cocktails, and miniature crab cakes that cost more than she made in an hour. With a deep breath, she pushed through the swinging doors back into the ballroom. The reception was in full swing now. A string quartet played softly in the corner, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd of expensively dressed guests. Melissa moved toward the head table, keeping her eyes focused on her tray. The seared scallops are wrapped in prosciutto, she explained, as she set the first plate down in front of the mother of the bride, and the pastry contains goat cheese with a honey drizzle. She worked her way around the table, carefully avoiding eye contact with Professor Williams for as long as possible. But eventually she reached his place. Your appetizer. Sir, she said, her voice professional but cool as she placed the plate before him. Thank you, Ms. Jenkins, he replied, and something in his tone made her look up. He was studying her with that same analytical gaze he'd used during her performances at school, like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. I must say, I'm surprised to see you here. You showed such promise. The way he said promise made it sound like a character flaw. Melissa felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral. Life takes unexpected turns, Professor. Enjoy your appetizer. She moved to serve the next person, but his voice stopped her. Do you still play? The piano, I mean. The question caught her off guard. Did she still play? Occasionally, when the apartment was empty and the longing became too much to bear, she'd visit the community center 2 blocks away. They had an old upright with yellowed keys and slightly flat middle octave, but it was better than nothing. She'd sit there for hours sometimes, playing softly so the center's director wouldn't complain. Sometimes, she answered, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his criticism had wounded her. He nodded thoughtfully. Such a shame. With proper discipline, you might have Dad. The young man sitting beside Professor Williams, his son the groom, cut him off with a warning look. Not now. Professor Williams shrugged and turned his attention to his plate. Melissa felt a rush of gratitude toward the young man, though she doubted he had any idea of their history. She finished serving the table and retreated to the kitchen, her cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Back in the service area, Greg was directing traffic like an air controller during a holiday rush. Jenkins, table 8 needs more water. Jones, the bride's grandmother at table 3, wants her dressing on the side. Move, people, move! Melissa grabbed a water pitcher and headed toward table 8, grateful for the distraction. As she weaved between tables, she caught snippets of conversation, business deals, family gossip, compliments on the bride's dress. Normal wedding talk. It all seemed so trivial compared to the storm of emotions brewing inside her. After refilling water glasses at 3 tables, she returned to the kitchen to prepare for the main course service. The chef was plating perfectly seared filet mignon with roasted fingerling potatoes and asparagus tips, the groom's choice. A second option of pan-seared salmon with lemon butter sauce, the bride's selection, was being prepared for those who had requested it. Head table gets served first, Greg reminded everyone. Then the parents' tables, then everyone else. And for God's sake, don't mix up the meat and fish orders. Melissa loaded her tray with plates for the head table, including Professor Williams's filet mignon, which she double-checked was prepared medium rare as requested. The tray was heavy, but she'd developed strong arms after 3 years of carrying similar loads. She approached the head table from the left, as proper service dictated. One by one, she set the plates in front of the guests, reciting the description of each dish. The conversation flowed around her as if she were invisible, a skill most servers developed early on. When she reached Professor Williams, she carefully set his plate down. Filet mignon medium rare with fingerling potatoes and seasonal vegetables. He looked up at her, and there was something different in his expression now. A hint of curiosity beneath the arrogance. "Thank you," he said, then added, "You know, I've had many students over the years. Most I forget, but I remember your performance." Melissa froze. She didn't want to have this conversation, not here, not now, not ever. But he continued. It was technically impressive. Your fingering was nearly flawless, but you took liberties with the tempo, the dynamics. You played it as if the music belonged to you, not the composer. Melissa felt eyes on her from around the table. She was painfully aware that she was creating a scene simply by standing there, listening to his critique. But some part of her needed to hear this, needed to understand why he had deemed her unworthy. That was the point, she said quietly, surprising herself with the courage to speak. Music doesn't belong to anyone once it's created. It exists to be interpreted, a flicker of something. Surprise? Respect? Crossed his face before he schooled his features. An interesting philosophy. Incorrect, but interesting. The woman beside him, his wife, Melissa presumed, touched his arm gently. "Richard, let the poor girl do her job. This is hardly the time or place." Melissa used the interruption to step away, moving to serve the next person. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the next plate. She had talked back to Professor Richard Williams. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. She finished serving the head table and moved to the next one, her mind replaying the brief exchange. Had she been unprofessional? Probably. Would Greg be mad if he found out? Definitely. But for the first time in 3 years, she had stood her ground with the man who had derailed her dreams. As the main course service continued, Melissa moved through the room on autopilot, her body going through the motions while her mind raced. By the time all 200 guests were served, she was emotionally exhausted. She slipped into the small alcove near the service entrance to catch her breath. "You're the piano girl, aren't you?" The voice startled her. Melissa turned to find the groom, Professor Williams' son, standing a few feet away. Up close she could see the resemblance, the same sharp jawline and observant eyes, though his were kinder. "I'm sorry?" "The piano student my father talks about sometimes. The one who played Prokofiev like a rebel." He smiled, and it transformed his face. "I was at that recital. I thought you were brilliant." Melissa stared at him, unsure how to respond. You were there?" He nodded. "I've disagreed with my father's teaching methods for years. He believes in rigid adherence to tradition. But I thought what you did was brave. Creative." "He failed me," Melissa said, the words coming out more bitter than she'd intended. The young man's smile faded. "I know. I argued with him about it afterward. For what it's worth, I think he was wrong." A call from across the room caught his attention. His bride, radiant in white, beckoning him to join her for photographs. He gave Melissa an apologetic look. "Duty calls. But hey, don't let him define you. Never let anyone do that." With a final smile, he hurried off to join his new wife. Melissa stood in the alcove, processing the unexpected encounter. Professor Williams' own son had appreciated her playing, had thought she was brilliant. The revelation was like a crack in a dam she'd built around her heart, letting in a trickle of something that felt dangerously like hope. The moment was shattered by Greg's voice over her earpiece. "Jenkins, where are you? We've got a situation. Meet me in the kitchen. Now." The urgency in his voice propelled her back to the service area. Greg was pacing near the dessert station, his face flushed with stress. "There you are. We've got a problem." Mrs. Peterson wants coffee service with the cake, but 2 of our coffee servers called in sick. I need you to handle the head table and tables 1 through 5. Melissa nodded. No problem. And the wedding planner is losing her mind about something. Find her and see what she needs before she has a complete breakdown. The wedding planner, a tall woman with a severe bun and a clipboard, was indeed on the verge of tears when Melissa found her near the gift table. Is everything okay?
Can I help?
Melissa asked. The woman, her name tag read Patricia, looked at Melissa with desperate eyes. The pianist for the reception hasn't shown up. He was supposed to be here an hour ago, but his wife just called and said he's in the emergency room with food poisoning. The first dance is in 20 minutes and we have no music. What about the string quartet? Melissa suggested. They've finished their contracted time and already left. Patricia clutched her clipboard like it was a life preserver. The DJ isn't scheduled to arrive until 9 for the dancing portion. I've called 4 different musicians, but no one can get here on such short notice on a Saturday night. Melissa bit her lip. What about recorded music? Surely the sound system. The bride specifically wanted live piano music for their first dance. It's a special arrangement of their song. Patricia looked close to collapse. Her father is paying a fortune for this wedding, and everything was perfect until now. This will ruin everything. Melissa's heart raced as an idea, a crazy, terrifying idea formed in her mind. Before she could think better of it, she heard herself say, I play piano. Patricia's head snapped up. What? I play piano, Melissa repeated, her voice stronger. I studied at the conservatory. Hope bloomed on Patricia's face. You did? Are you any good? Could you play for the first dance? And maybe a few songs after? We can pay you, of course. A voice in Melissa's head screamed that this was insane. She hadn't performed in front of people in 3 years, and to play at Professor Williams's son's wedding. It was too much. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, reminded her of what the groom had said. Don't let him define you. I'd need to see the music first, Melissa said. And I'd have to clear it with my manager. Patricia grabbed Melissa's hand. Oh, thank you. The sheet music is with the band equipment backstage. I'll talk to your manager right now. You might have just saved this wedding. As Patricia hurried off to find Greg, Melissa stood frozen, the full weight of what she'd just volunteered for crashing down on her. She was going to play piano at a wedding, in front of 200 people, including Professor Richard Williams. What had she just done? Melissa stood backstage in the small area behind the grand piano, staring at the sheet music in her trembling hands. The wedding planner, Patricia, had thrust it at her moments ago while speaking a mile a minute about timing and cues. Now alone, Melissa scanned the notes. A special arrangement of Can't Help Falling in Love for the couple's first dance, followed by a selection of romantic classics for the dinner hour. Jenkins. Greg's voice made her jump. He appeared from the service corridor, his face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. What's this I hear about you abandoning your tables to play piano? The regular pianist is sick and they needed... I don't care if the Queen of England needs a back scratcher. You're on the clock as a server, not a musician. He ran a hand over his thinning hair. I've got 200 people out there expecting dessert and coffee and you're back here playing Carnegie Hall? Melissa flinched at his harsh tone but stood her ground. Patricia said she cleared it with you. She mentioned it and I told her absolutely not. We're short-staffed as it is. Please, Greg. Melissa surprised herself with the desperation in her voice. I need to do this. Something in her tone made him pause. He studied her face and his expression softened slightly. Why? What's so important about playing piano at this wedding? How could she explain? That the father of the groom had crushed her dreams and that this was her chance to prove him wrong? That for 3 years she'd been hiding from the thing she loved most because one man had told her she wasn't good enough? The professor at the head table, she said slowly. He was my piano teacher at the conservatory. He failed me in my final recital. He's the reason I dropped out. Understanding dawned on Greg's face. And now you want to show him up? I want to play again. Melissa corrected him, though there was truth in his assessment too. Just for an hour, please. I'll work a double shift next weekend to make up for it. Greg sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that said he knew he'd regret his decision. Fine, 1 hour. But if any of your tables complain about service, you're back on the floor immediately. Understood? Melissa nodded, relief washing over her. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. Tanya will cover your tables, but she'll be stretched thin. And you'd better be as good as Patricia thinks you are. With that, he turned and headed back to the kitchen, muttering something about artistic temperaments under his breath. Alone again, Melissa looked down at the sheet music. The notes swam before her eyes as anxiety tightened her chest. What had she been thinking? She hadn't performed in front of an audience in 3 years. She'd practiced on that old community center piano, sure, but never anything formal and certainly nothing like this. A wealthy couple's first dance at their wedding, with 200 guests watching. Including Professor Williams, 2 minutes. Patricia's voice hissed from the side entrance as she stuck her head in. The bride and groom are about to be announced for their first dance. Melissa nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. She smoothed down her server's uniform, hardly appropriate attire for a pianist, and took a deep breath. She could do this. It was just playing piano, the thing she'd once loved more than anything in the world. She stepped onto the small stage where the grand piano waited. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway, she noted with appreciation, far nicer than anything she'd played in years. The ballroom lights had been dimmed, with soft spotlights illuminating the dance floor. Most of the guests probably wouldn't even notice her, focused as they would be on the newlyweds. That thought calmed her slightly as she settled onto the bench and adjusted it to the right height. She placed the sheet music on the stand and flexed her fingers. The cool ivory keys felt both foreign and familiar beneath her fingertips. Ladies and gentlemen, the wedding planner's voice rang out through the ballroom. Please welcome, for their first dance as husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson Williams. Applause erupted as the double doors opened and the couple entered hand in hand. The bride's white dress seemed to glow under the spotlights, and the groom, Professor Williams's son, beamed with happiness. They took their positions in the center of the dance floor, and all eyes were on them. All eyes except those of Professor Williams, Melissa noticed with a jolt. He was looking directly at her, his expression unreadable from this distance. Patricia gave Melissa a frantic nod. That was her cue. Drawing a deep breath, she began to play. The first few notes came out hesitantly, her fingers stiff with nerves. But as the familiar melody of Can't Help Falling in Love filled the room, something shifted inside her. The music, the beautiful, timeless music, took over. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget, moving across the keys with growing confidence. On the dance floor, the bride and groom swayed in perfect rhythm to her playing. Melissa allowed herself to glance up briefly and saw the love radiating between them. It touched something inside her, and she poured that feeling back into the music, adding subtle embellishments to the arrangement that made it uniquely hers. As the song progressed, she forgot about the audience, forgot about Professor Williams, forgot about everything except the conversation between her fingers and the piano. This was why she had fallen in love with music in the first place, this magical ability to translate emotion into sound. When she struck the final chord, there was a moment of perfect silence before applause burst forth. The bride wiped a tear from her cheek, and the groom was looking at Melissa with gratitude clear on his face. She gave a small nod in acknowledgement, trying to ignore the flutter of pride in her chest. According to Patricia's instructions, she was to continue playing soft background music as guests returned to their tables for dessert and coffee. She transitioned smoothly into Debussy's Clair de Lune, one of her personal favorites, letting the dreamy melody fill the ballroom. As servers began distributing cake and coffee, Melissa caught sight of Tanya juggling multiple dessert plates. A twinge of guilt hit her. Her friend was covering her workload while she sat here playing piano. But when Tanya caught her eye across the room, she gave Melissa a thumbs up and a wide grin. Halfway through her third piece, a gentle rendition of La Vie en Rose, Melissa sensed movement to her right. Someone had approached the piano. Without missing a note, she glanced over to find the groom standing there, a warm smile on his face. "That was beautiful," he said quietly so as not to disturb her playing. "Our first dance was perfect thanks to you." Melissa returned his smile but kept playing. "I'm glad I could help. My wife wants to know if you take requests." "Depends on the request," she replied, surprising herself with her ease in this conversation. "Moon River?" "For her grandmother. It's her favorite." Melissa nodded. "Next on my list. He grinned and placed something on the piano, a folded napkin with what looked like cash inside. "You've saved our wedding twice tonight. First as a server, now as our musician. Thank you." Before she could respond, he was gone, returning to his bride at the head table. Melissa seamlessly transitioned into Moon River, watching as an elderly woman's face lit up in recognition. The woman clasped her hands to her heart and looked around in delight, searching for the source of the music. When her eyes landed on Melissa, she smiled and mouthed, "Thank you." That simple moment of connection warmed Melissa from within. This was what music was meant to do: build bridges between people, evoke emotions, create memories. She continued playing, one song flowing into the next. Her initial hour was nearly up, but Greg hadn't appeared to summon her back to serving duties, so she kept going. The repertoire she'd been given was running out, so she began to play from memory, pieces she'd practiced countless times at the conservatory and, later, alone at the community center, lost in the music. She didn't immediately notice when someone else approached the piano. It wasn't until she heard a throat being cleared that she looked up to find Professor Williams standing beside her. Her fingers faltered momentarily before she recovered, continuing to play as if his presence didn't affect her, but her heart was racing, and she could feel his critical gaze upon her hands. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone she remembered from his lectures. "You play well." The compliment, if it could be called that, was delivered without warmth. Melissa kept her eyes on the keys. "Thank you, Professor. Your technique has improved since your time at the conservatory." More controlled, she wasn't sure how to respond to that. Was he actually giving her a compliment, or finding a roundabout way to remind her of her past failure? "I still practice," she said simply. He nodded, watching her hands move across the keys. "You're still taking liberties with the tempo." "Yes," she agreed, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "I am." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise at her directness, perhaps. Interesting choice for a wedding. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major is traditionally played with more restraint. The bride's grandmother requested something dreamy, Melissa replied. "I thought a little rubato was appropriate for the occasion." Professor Williams raised an eyebrow. "And you prioritize the audience's enjoyment over the composer's intentions?" The question was a trap, the same argument they'd had at the conservatory. But Melissa was no longer the intimidated student she had been. "I believe the composer's intentions included moving the listener," she said, never missing a note as she spoke. "If my interpretation achieves that, then yes, I prioritize the emotional connection." A heavy silence fell between them, filled only by the lilting notes of Chopin. Around them, the wedding reception continued. Guests chatting over coffee, servers clearing plates, the bride and groom making their rounds to thank their guests. "My son tells me you stepped in at the last minute," Professor Williams said finally. "That was generous of you." Was that another compliment? Melissa couldn't tell. "It was an opportunity I couldn't pass up," she said truthfully. He nodded slowly. "Well, don't let me disturb you further. Please continue." He turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Miss Jenkins, yes?" "Your left hand is still a bit heavy on the bass line. Something to consider." With that, he walked away, leaving Melissa with a familiar mixture of frustration and determination. Some things never changed. Even now, he couldn't resist critiquing her playing. But as she watched him return to his seat, something dawned on her. His criticism no longer had the power to crush her. 3 years ago, a comment like that would have sent her into a spiral of self-doubt. Now it was just one man's opinion. With a small smile playing at her lips, Melissa deliberately leaned into the bass line, making it slightly more prominent than before. It was a tiny act of rebellion, probably unnoticed by anyone except herself and possibly Professor Williams. But it felt good. It felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from her. As the last notes of the nocturne faded, she transitioned into a piece she'd composed herself during those lonely practice sessions at the community center. It was raw and imperfect, but wholly hers, something Professor Williams could never critique because there was no correct interpretation. For the first time in 3 years, Melissa Jenkins played not for approval or validation, but for the pure joy of creation. And it felt like coming home. Time seemed to both stand still and fly by as Melissa played. What was supposed to be a 1-hour fill-in performance had stretched to nearly 2. The dessert course had come and gone, Coffee cups were being refilled, and still she played on. Her hands should have been tired, but they weren't. They were alive. Awakened after a long slumber, she'd moved from classical pieces to more contemporary songs, gauging the room's energy and adjusting accordingly. When conversation grew louder, she'd play something more upbeat. When it quieted, she'd shift to something more contemplative. It was like having a conversation with the entire room through her fingertips. "You're a hit," Tanya whispered as she passed by the piano with a tray of coffee mugs. "People keep asking who you are." Melissa smiled, never pausing in her playing. "How are my tables?" "All taken care of. Greg's actually in a good mood because some guests left bigger tips after hearing you play." Tanya winked. "Keep it up. Maybe you can get a real job as a musician and leave this place." The thought sent a small thrill through Melissa. A real job as a musician. It had been her dream once, before Professor Williams had deemed her unworthy. Was it possible that dream wasn't as dead as she'd thought? As if summoned by her thoughts, she noticed movement at the head table. The wedding party was dispersing, and Professor Williams was deep in conversation with an older gentleman Melissa didn't recognize. They both kept glancing her way as they spoke, making her slightly nervous. She shifted her focus back to the piano, launching into a livelier tune as younger guests began to gather around her. A woman about her age approached with a shy smile. "Do you know any Billy Joel?" she asked during a brief pause between songs. Melissa nodded. "Any particular song?" "Just the Way You Are. It's my boyfriend's favorite." With a smile, Melissa began to play the requested song. The woman squealed in delight and hurried back to her table, dragging her boyfriend to the small open space beside the piano. They began to dance, and soon other couples joined them. What had begun as background music was turning into an impromptu dance party, right there in the middle of this fancy wedding reception. The DJ wasn't scheduled to arrive for another hour, and the guests clearly didn't want to wait. More and more people approached with requests, and Melissa accommodated as many as she could, blending songs together in a seamless medley. "Piano Man." Someone called out. "Tiny Dancer," shouted another. "Do you know any Taylor Swift?" Melissa laughed, her fingers flying across the keys. She felt like a different person than the nervous waitress who had dreaded serving Professor Williams just hours ago. Here behind the piano, she was in control. She was creating something beautiful, and people were responding to it. The bride appeared at her side, her white dress slightly rumpled from a night of celebration. "You're amazing," she said, her eyes shining with sincerity. "Would you mind playing something special for my dad? He's leaving soon. Early flight tomorrow." "Of course," Melissa replied. "What would he like?" "What a wonderful world. It's from his generation," the bride giggled. "And maybe something more upbeat after? The night's still young." Melissa transitioned smoothly into the Louis Armstrong classic, watching as the bride led her father to the dance floor. They swayed together, the love between them obvious in the way he looked down at his daughter with misty eyes. It was moments like these, creating the soundtrack to genuine human connection, that made music so powerful. As promised, she followed the gentle ballad with something more energetic, and the dance floor filled again. The atmosphere in the ballroom had transformed from formal dining to joyous celebration, and Melissa felt a rush of pride knowing she had contributed to that shift. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the happiness around her. The groom was chatting with friends near the gift table. The bride's grandmother was tapping her hand on the tablecloth in time with the music. Even Greg, standing near the service entrance, was nodding his head slightly to the beat. And then there was Professor Williams, still deep in conversation with the older gentleman. They were both watching her now, not even pretending to do otherwise. The professor's expression was unreadable, but his companion seemed animated, gesturing toward the piano as he spoke. Before Melissa could wonder too much about it, she was distracted by more song requests. A group of college-aged guests had gathered around the piano, calling out titles of popular songs. She did her best to accommodate them, sometimes playing simplified versions when she didn't know a song well, other times improvising based on her memory of the melody. The bride's cousin wanted Bohemian Rhapsody, which made Melissa laugh, a nearly impossible request for solo piano, but she gave it her best shot, much to the delight of the young man and his friends. They sang along loudly, not caring that they missed half the notes. It was during this chaotic, joyful moment that Melissa noticed Professor Williams and his companion approaching the piano. Her stomach tightened, but she kept playing, focusing on the music rather than their approach. "Ms. Jenkins," Professor Williams' voice cut through the noise of the singing guests. "May I introduce Dr. Robert Chen? He's the director of the Westlake Arts Center." Melissa nodded in acknowledgement but couldn't stop playing in the middle of the song. The singing guests were too invested and she didn't want to disappoint them. Dr. Chen seemed to understand, smiling as he waited for a natural break in the music. When she finally reached the end of the song, amid cheers from the impromptu choir, she turned to the two men with questioning eyes. "That was quite impressive," Dr. Chen said, extending his hand. "Richard has been telling me about you." Melissa shook his hand, shooting a suspicious glance at Professor Williams. What exactly had he been saying? "All good things, I assure you," Dr. Chen continued, catching her look. "He mentioned you studied at the conservatory." "Yes," Melissa answered cautiously.
3 years ago, and now you're a server?"
There was no judgment in his voice, just curiosity, among other things. She didn't want to admit that serving at the Bellamy was her primary source of income, that her music had been relegated to stolen moments on a worn-out community center piano. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you play beautifully, very expressive, and your ability to adapt to audience requests is remarkable." "Thank you," Melissa said, surprised by the compliment. Professor Williams cleared his throat. "Dr. Chen runs the community music program at Westlake. They offer lessons, performances, that sort of thing. We also have a small concert series," Dr. Chen added. "Nothing fancy, but we showcase local talent. And we're actually in need of a pianist for our youth program. Our previous instructor moved out of state last month." Melissa's heart skipped a beat. Was this heading where she thought it was? "Richard suggested I might want to hear you play tonight." Dr. Chen smiled warmly. He was right. Melissa looked at Professor Williams in disbelief. He had recommended her, after everything? "Don't look so surprised, Ms. Jenkins," Professor Williams said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I may be strict, but I do recognize talent when I see it." "Even if we disagree on interpretation," Dr. Chen chuckled. "Richard and I have been friends for 30 years, and we still argue about Chopin. But that's what makes music interesting, isn't it? Different perspectives." Melissa nodded, still processing what was happening. "So you're offering me—" "What exactly?" "A job," Dr. Chen said simply. "Teaching piano to beginners, mostly children. 3 days a week. And if you're interested, a spot in our concert series next month. It doesn't pay much, I'm afraid, but it's a start. A job teaching piano, a chance to perform." Melissa felt lightheaded, as if this were happening to someone else. After 3 years of believing her music career was over before it had even begun, here was an opportunity appearing out of nowhere. And strangest of all, it had come through Professor Williams. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say you'll think about it," Dr. Chen replied, pulling a business card from his pocket and placing it on the piano. "Call me on Monday. We can discuss details." With that, he excused himself, mentioning something about saying goodbye to the bride's parents before leaving. Professor Williams lingered, an uncharacteristic awkwardness about him. "Why?" Melissa asked finally. "Why would you recommend me after failing me at the conservatory?" He sighed, looking older suddenly. "The conservatory and the real world are different places, Ms. Jenkins. What I look for in students is technical perfection, adherence to classical tradition. But what Robert needs is someone who can connect with young people, make them love music." He glanced around at the dance floor, where guests were still moving to the echo of Melissa's last song. "You clearly have that gift. You've turned a stuffy wedding reception into something alive." Melissa didn't know how to respond. Was this his way of apologizing? Or just a pragmatic decision to help his friend find a piano teacher? "Besides this," he added with the faintest hint of a smile, "my son hasn't stopped talking about your playing since your final recital. He thinks I was too harsh in my assessment. Perhaps he wasn't entirely wrong." Coming from Professor Williams, this was as close to a retraction as she was likely to get. Melissa felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the knot of resentment she'd carried for 3 years. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the recommendation." He nodded once, then turned to go. Before he could walk away, Melissa added, "I still disagree with you about interpretation, though." Professor Williams looked back, and to her surprise, he actually chuckled. "I would expect nothing less, Ms. Jenkins. Good evening." As he walked away, Melissa felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The approval she had once desperately sought from him no longer seemed so important. What mattered was that she had found her way back to music on her own terms. The bride approached the piano again, breaking Melissa out of her thoughts. "One more song before the DJ arrives? Something really special to end your set?" Melissa smiled. "Any requests?" "Something that shows off what you can really do," the bride suggested. "Something that comes from your heart." Melissa thought for a moment, then placed her hands on the keys. She began to play the same piece she had performed at her final recital 3 years ago, the one Professor Williams had failed her for. But this time she played it with confidence, embracing the creative liberties that made the piece uniquely hers. The wedding guests grew quiet as the music filled the ballroom. There was something different about this performance, a depth of emotion, a sense of story being told through the notes. Even those who knew nothing about classical music could feel it. This wasn't background music. This was art. From across the room, Melissa caught Professor Williams watching. He stood perfectly still, his expression thoughtful. She didn't seek his approval, didn't need his validation. She played for herself, and for the joy of creating something beautiful in this moment. When the final notes faded, there was a beat of silence before the room erupted in applause. Guests rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Melissa stood from the piano bench and gave a small bow, her cheeks flushing with pleasure. The DJ had arrived during her performance and was setting up his equipment in the corner. Her unexpected concert was officially over, but something else was just beginning. As she stepped away from the piano, business card in hand and possibilities spinning through her mind, Melissa knew one thing for certain. The waitress who had refused to serve at the wedding had found her way back to the music that had always been waiting for her. 6 months later, Melissa stood in the wings of the small stage at the Westlake Arts Center, watching as Dr. Chen introduced her to the audience. The community recital hall wasn't grand like the conservatory where she had once performed, but tonight it felt perfect. About 100 people filled the seats, parents of her piano students, local music lovers, and a few familiar faces from the Bellamy Hotel. And it gives me great pleasure to present our newest faculty member, whose dedication to music and exceptional teaching has already made a tremendous impact on our youth program. Please welcome Melissa Jenkins. Applause filled the room as Melissa walked onto the stage. She wore a simple black dress, borrowed from Tanya, who sat in the front row giving her an enthusiastic thumbs up. Taking a seat at the piano, Melissa adjusted the bench and took a deep breath. This was her first formal performance since that fateful day at the conservatory, and though butterflies danced in her stomach, they were born of excitement rather than fear. The month since the Peterson-Williams wedding had been a whirlwind of change. She'd called Dr. Chen the Monday after, half expecting the offer to have been a dream or a misunderstanding. Instead, she'd found herself with a part-time position teaching piano to students ranging from 5-year-old beginners to talented teenagers. She still worked weekends at the Bellamy. She enjoyed it more than she'd expected, especially after Greg had promoted her to events coordinator. But 3 days a week, she got to share her love of music with eager young minds. Now, facing her first recital as both teacher and performer, Melissa placed her hands on the keys and began to play. She'd chosen a program that reflected her journey, starting with a traditional piece played mostly by the book, then gradually incorporating more of her own interpretations and style. The final piece would be an original composition, something she'd been working on in the early mornings before her students arrived. As the music flowed from her fingers, Melissa's thoughts drifted to the unexpected ways her life had changed. Her small apartment now housed an upright piano, a gift from the parents of twins she taught, who were upgrading their own instrument. Her refrigerator was covered with thank you drawings from her youngest students, and her phone contained a growing list of performance opportunities, small venues, local events, and even a wedding or two. The first half of her program went smoothly, each piece flowing naturally into the next. During a brief pause to turn her sheet music, Melissa glanced at the audience. Tanya was beaming proudly. Beside her sat several other servers from the Bellamy, who had rearranged their schedules to attend. Dr. Chen watched from the side of the room, nodding in approval, and there in the back row sat Professor Williams. Melissa nearly missed a note at the sight of him. She hadn't expected him to come, though Dr. Chen had mentioned inviting him. Their paths had crossed occasionally over the past months, at music education conferences, at a fundraiser for the Arts Center, but they had maintained a polite distance. Their conversations brief and professional. She refocused on the music, pushing thoughts of the professor from her mind. This performance wasn't about him or his approval. It was about her journey, about reclaiming what she had lost and building something new from it. The remainder of her classical selections went well, earning warm applause from the audience. Then came the moment she'd been both anticipating and dreading, her original composition. She hadn't shared it with anyone yet, not even Dr. Chen. For my final piece tonight, she spoke into the microphone for the first time, her voice steady despite her nerves. I'll be playing something I composed over these past few months. It's called The Reluctant Server, and it tells the story of how I ended up here tonight. A small chuckle rippled through the audience. Many of them knew parts of her story by now. Taking a deep breath, Melissa began to play. The piece opened quietly, hesitantly, like someone afraid to raise their voice. The melody was simple at first, almost childlike in its directness. Then came a section of discord, jarring notes that clashed against each other, representing the painful rejection she'd experienced. This dissolved into a minor key passage that captured the feeling of being lost, of working at the Bellamy while her true passion gathered dust. Then, like a ray of light breaking through clouds, came the transition. The key shifted to major, the tempo quickened, and the melody returned but transformed. What had been hesitant was now confident. What had been simple was now rich with complexity. As the piece built to its climax, Melissa incorporated elements of the wedding songs she'd played that fateful night, weaving them into her own melody until they created something entirely new. The final section was pure joy, fast, complex, and emotionally raw. Her fingers danced across the keys, no longer bound by anyone's expectations but her own. As she played the final chord, letting it ring out into the hushed room, Melissa felt a sense of completion. The journey from rejected student to reluctant server to musician reclaiming her art, it was all there in the music. For a moment after she finished, there was silence. Then the audience erupted in applause, rising to their feet. Dr. Chen approached the stage with a bouquet of flowers. Tanya was wiping tears from her eyes while clapping so hard it looked painful. Even the stoic Greg was smiling broadly. As Melissa took her bows, her gaze drifted to the back of the room again. Professor Williams was standing with the others, his hands coming together in measured applause. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and he gave her a small nod. Not quite approval, not quite apology, but acknowledgement. It was enough. The reception afterward was held in the Arts Center's lobby. Well-wishers surrounded Melissa, offering congratulations and praise. Parents of her students shared stories of how their children now rushed to practice rather than having to be reminded. Dr. Chen introduced her to potential donors for the youth program. Tanya hugged her fiercely, declaring that her best friend was going to be famous someday. As the crowd began to thin, Melissa found herself standing alone by the refreshment table, catching her breath after the emotional evening. A voice behind her made her turn. Your composition was quite moving. Ms. Jenkins, Professor Williams stood there, looking somewhat out of place with his formal posture and serious expression. Thank you, Melissa replied. Surprised by the compliment, he cleared his throat. Your technique has improved considerably. Melissa couldn't help but smile at his inability to offer praise without critique. Some things never changed. I've been practicing, she said simply. Yes, well, he shifted uncomfortably. Robert tells me you've done wonders with the children's program. Enrollment has doubled since you joined the faculty. The kids are amazing, Melissa said, her face lighting up as she thought of her students. They just need someone to show them that music isn't just about rules and technique. It's about expression, about finding their own voice. Professor Williams raised an eyebrow. Rules and technique are the foundation upon which expression is built. And yet, without expression, rules and technique are just empty exercises, she countered. To her surprise, he chuckled. Still as stubborn as ever, I see. I prefer to call it artistic conviction, Melissa replied with a hint of a smile. They stood in silence for a moment, the years of resentment and hurt feelings hanging between them like a curtain slowly being drawn back. I may have been, Overly harsh in my assessment of your final conservatory performance, Professor Williams said finally, the words seeming difficult for him to speak. While I stand by my critique of your technical choices, I failed to recognize the emotional depth of your interpretation. Coming from him, this was tantamount to a full apology. Melissa took a moment to absorb his words. Thank you for saying that, she said quietly. It means a lot to hear it. He nodded, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. The reason I came tonight, beyond curiosity about your progress, was to deliver this. The conservatory is holding a series of alumni concerts next season. Dr. Chen submitted your name for consideration. He held out the envelope. This is an official invitation to perform. Melissa stared at the envelope, her heart racing. A chance to return to the conservatory stage, not as a student being judged, but as an invited performer. It was a form of validation she hadn't even realized she still wanted. Think about it, Professor Williams said as she took the envelope with slightly shaking hands. You would be representing both the conservatory and Westlake. It would be an opportunity to showcase how you've evolved as an artist. I will, she promised, tucking the invitation into her purse. Thank you for bringing this. He nodded again, then glanced at his watch. I should be going. Early class tomorrow. As he turned to leave, Melissa called after him. Professor? He looked back questioningly. Would you be interested in hearing my students play sometime? They're having a small recital next month. Nothing fancy, just beginners mostly, but they're so passionate about it. Something softened in his expression. I would like that, Ms. Jenkins. Perhaps I could offer some feedback on your teaching methods. As long as you promise not to make any of them cry, she said. Only half joking. I make no such promises, he replied. But there was a hint of humor in his voice. Good night, Ms. Jenkins, and congratulations on a fine performance. As Professor Williams walked away, Melissa felt the last piece of a puzzle falling into place. The pain of that long-ago failure hadn't disappeared entirely. It had shaped her, for better or worse, but it no longer defined her. What defined her now was the music she created, the students she taught, and the joy she had rediscovered. Tanya appeared at her side, draping an arm around her shoulders. So, Ms. Famous Pianist, are we celebrating? A bunch of us are heading to that little jazz place around the corner. Melissa smiled, tucking the conservatory invitation deeper into her purse. That was tomorrow's concern. Tonight was for celebrating how far she had come. Absolutely, she said, but there's something I want to do first. 15 minutes later, Melissa sat at the piano in the now empty recital hall, playing just for herself in the dim light of the empty stage. No audience, no pressure, no expectations, just the pure pleasure of fingers on keys and music in the air. This was where it had all begun, long before conservatories and professors and failed recitals. Just a girl who had fallen in love with the way pressing a key could create something beautiful out of silence. As she played in the empty hall, Melissa thought about the unlikely path that had led her here, from devastated student to reluctant server, to the pianist who had brought a wedding reception to life. If she hadn't been assigned to serve at that specific wedding, if the regular pianist hadn't gotten sick, if she hadn't found the courage to step up, life was full of such moments. Small decisions that led to unexpected places. The waitress who had refused to serve at a wedding had found her way back to music. And in doing so, she had also found herself.